Desde su captura en abril de 1989, ha pasado 32 años preso. ¿Cómo está su salud?
Mi salud es pésima.
The world's most wanted drug trafficker is headed to prison for life.
Nobody's ever broken out of the Supermax prison here in Colorado. This airtight penitentiary has housed the worst of the worst, including billionaire cartel kingpin Joaquin El Chapo Guzman.
July 2024, Ezekiel Romo, a notorious drug trafficker, found himself back in jail 8 years after his release for similar crimes. But this time, a fatal altercation in prison didn't just change his life, it put an end to it in the most horrific way imaginable. Let's take a look at some tragic fates for horrific cartel members behind bars.
His face says it all. The most powerful drug lord ever to live, reduced to tears.
What better name to begin this video with than the name Joaquin El Chapo Guzman? El Chapo, born Joaquin Guzman Loera, was once one of the most notorious and elusive drug lords of our time. His name became synonymous with the Sinaloa Cartel, the sprawling criminal organization he led to the heights of global notoriety. Known for his daring prison escapes, his influence spanned continents, and his operations raked in billions through drug trafficking, money laundering, and a staggering list of other illicit activities. But after years of playing a cat-and-mouse game with law enforcement, El Chapo's luck ran out in 2016 when Mexican authorities, in coordination with the DEA, captured him in a dramatic raid. From there, he was extradited to the US, where his life took a turn for the worse.
The fact that we were able to get him extradited to the United States, that's a grand slam. The man will not see daylight again.
July 17th, 2019, El Chapo was given life in prison plus 30 years after being convicted on a 17-count indictment. He's now serving time at the notorious ADX Florence, a facility so brutal that many describe life inside as nothing short of hell on earth. Located in Florence, Colorado, the ADX is simply the most secure prison in the US. The prison facility was designed to break even the most hardened criminals. Inmates spend 23 hours a day in a concrete cell, with a steel door sealing them off from any human contact. The walls are cold and soundproof, making the silence deafening and suffocating. The only glimpse of the outside world comes through a small, narrow window, too high to see out of. Inmates are allowed out of their cells for only an hour. However, during that period, some inmates like El Chapo are bound at their wrists and ankles with chains. Each cell has a bed, a desk, and a stool, all constructed purely out of concrete. Then right beside the door is a toilet. That toilet's designed to flush itself once clogged, meaning there aren't any WC handles. El Chapo's cell is one of the few ones that have a shower within, and this shower's on a scheduled timer. There's also a little sink that works without a potentially dangerous tap. Some cells have steel mirrors that have been bolted to the walls, and some have television sets. El Chapo's cell has a TV, but the programs shown are monitored. He can only watch recreational, educational, and religious shows. Sometimes they give him books and magazines if he ever wishes to read, but we highly doubt he's doing any reading here. Outside his cell is as nightmarish as inside. There's a multitude of motion detectors, surveillance cameras, and 1,400 remote-controlled steel doors. Correctional officers monitor inmates 24 hours a day. There's also something known as a panic button, which is basically a single red button that once pushed, every door in the facility closes immediately. In addition, we have pressure pads and 12-foot razor wire fences surrounding the perimeter, which is patrolled by heavily armed officers. And finally, there are 12 different gun towers down the road leading to ADX Florence.
About the brutality of isolation. What do you mean by that?
It breaks down the human spirit or the human psyche.
This level of isolation drives many to the brink of insanity, and El Chapo may not be an exception here. His lawyers have argued that the extreme security measures, along with the constant surveillance of his cell block, have left him sleep-deprived and have even caused him to experience hallucinations. You can argue that a man like El Chapo doesn't deserve anything less, and this time, we don't think he'll be doing any jailbreaks.
No tengo pronóstico de vida ninguno, puesto que perdí todo. Perdí la sensibilidad, los oídos, los ojos.
August 2021, Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo finally granted an interview after 32 years behind bars. Incarcerated at the Puente Grande Maximum Prison in Jalisco, Mexico, he was confined to a wheelchair, had lost vision in one of his eyes, had 4 broken ribs, and was partially deaf in his left ear. His health was so deteriorated that even the interviewer had to hold up plastic boards for him to read, since he could barely hear or even see them. But this was a stark contrast from the man he once was. Miguel was El Padrino, the Godfather, a major player in the world of drug trafficking. In the 80s, Felix was at the helm of the Guadalajara cartel. He wasn't just a typical drug dealer, he was a mastermind who helped shape the cartel into a highly organized operation. Gallardo knew how to work the system, making crucial alliances with other criminal groups and ensuring his cartel controlled a significant chunk of the drug routes into the U.S. His ability to keep the cartel running smoothly and avoid the violence that plagued the other drug factions allowed him to build a vast empire. However, his empire faced a major threat in 1985 with the death of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena. Kiki had begun uncovering the links between drug traffickers, Mexican law enforcement, and high-ranking officials within the Mexican political party, Partido Revolucionario Institucional. His discoveries were a big threat to the drug trafficking market, but particularly to Miguel's operations. So in retaliation, he ordered Camarena to be abducted as he left the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara. Camarena was brutally tortured and interrogated for 30 hours before he was murdered. This incident led to a massive investigation by both U.S. and Mexican authorities, which put Miguel Gallardo squarely in the crosshairs. The murder drew serious attention and pressure, and soon enough, the walls started closing in on him. By 1989, law enforcement had gathered enough evidence to bring Miguel Felix Gallardo to justice. He was arrested and convicted on multiple charges, including drug trafficking and murder. His arrest was a game changer, leading to the breakup of the Guadalajara cartel into several rival groups, like the Tijuana and Sinaloa cartels. He was initially sentenced to 40 years in prison for the murder and kidnapping of DEA agent Enrique Camarena, along with multiple other crimes. However, in 2017, he was retried and sentenced to an additional 37 years behind bars, where, to put it plainly, he lost everything. During the initial years of his sentence, he controlled his cartel with his cell phone from behind bars. However, in the latter years, as his health went on a downward spiral, Miguel couldn't even control himself to talk less of his cartel. Yet even after all those years, Miguel still denies having a hand in Camarena's death.
Ignoro el por qué se me relaciona, porque ese señor no lo conocí.
Whether or not he had a hand in Camarena's death doesn't even matter anymore. He's currently 78 years old and on house arrest. If you had a health crisis on top of this, we're pretty sure he's not a threat to anyone right now.
Juan Garcia Abrego is going to be tracked down by authorities on both sides of the border, and we're going to do everything in our power to see that he is brought to justice.
Federal agents have been after him for years. Tonight, correspondent Jim Stewart reports they have him.
Juan Garcia Abrego was a notorious Mexican drug lord who rose to prominence as the head of the Gulf Cartel, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Mexico during the late 20th century. Born in Tamaulipas, Mexico in 1944, Garcia Abrego came from a modest background, but his ambitions led him into the lucrative world of drug trafficking. By the 1980s, he transformed the Gulf Cartel from a regional smuggling operation into a multinational enterprise that specialized in the trafficking of cocaine from Colombia into the U.S. Garcia's ascent to power was largely facilitated by his strategic partnership with the Cali Cartel of Colombia, which supplied him with vast quantities of cocaine. This relationship allowed the Gulf Cartel to dominate drug routes throughout Mexico and into the U.S., particularly along the Texas-Mexican border. And unlike other cartel leaders, Abrego took a pragmatic approach to his operations. He forged alliances with various factions, including corrupt law enforcement officials and politicians, ensuring that his cartel could operate with relative impunity. This ability to manipulate the system made him a highly effective and dangerous figure in the world of organized crime. However, it didn't last. By 1995, Garcia had become one of the DEA's most wanted criminals. In response, he took measures to maintain his power, including bribing Mexican officials and even attempting to influence U.S. authorities. But despite these efforts, his downfall was inevitable, as pressure mounted from both the Mexican and U.S. governments. In 1996, after years of evading capture, Abrego was arrested in Monterrey, Mexico, and swiftly extradited to the U.S., a rare move at the time for a Mexican national. In 1997, Garcia Abrego was convicted in a U.S. federal court on charges of drug trafficking, money laundering, and organized crime. He was given 11 life terms in prison, effectively ending his reign as a drug lord. He has since remained incarcerated in the U.S., serving his sentence at the U.S. Penitentiary Hazleton in Preston County, West Virginia. Inside this prison, Abrego's power, money, and influence mean nothing. It has earned the nickname Misery Mountain because life there is truly a misery. Inmates live under constant tension, with gang rivalries and frequent outbreaks of violence, creating an ever-present sense of danger. Stabbings, assaults, and murders are pretty common, as overcrowding and understaffing heighten the already volatile environment. The prison's strict routines and tight security measures also add to the pressure. Inmates face extended periods of lockdown, limited recreational time, and minimal contact with the outside world. Solitary confinement is often used for discipline, leaving prisoners isolated in small cells. So it's clear what life is like now for Garcia Abrego, and considering that he's currently 80 years old, we can only imagine that it gets worse. It's rare for cartel drug lords to face execution in the U.S., but Juan Garza's crimes were so heinous that the country had made an exception in his case. Born and raised in Brownsville, Texas, Garza drifted into drug trafficking at a very young age, becoming the leader of a marijuana smuggling ring that operated across the U.S.-Mexican border. His operations were large-scale, and with time, the stakes got higher. But unlike other cartel drug lords, Garza's activities went beyond just drugs. He was linked to several murders, using violence as a way to maintain control over his empire. He's said to have committed at least 3 murders in a bid to further his drug smuggling activities. In the early 1990s, law enforcement finally caught up with Garza after tapping into his phone and forcing his co-workers in their custody to flip on him. The U.S. government wasn't just interested in putting a stop to his drug trade. They had evidence tying him to numerous murders. So the turning point in his life came in 1993, when he was arrested and charged not only with running a massive drug operation, but also with those killings. During his trial, Garza was portrayed as a ruthless leader who would eliminate anyone who crossed his path, earning him the death penalty. July 13, 1999, Garza was taken by federal authorities from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice into the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Garza, along with 2 other inmates on death row, were then relocated to the federal death row at USP Terre Haute in Indiana. And after exhausting all appeals, he was executed by lethal injection on June 19, 2001, at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute. But hold on, there's more. Garza's execution occurred just 8 days after the execution of Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh at the same facility. Originally, Garza was scheduled to be executed in December 2000, but he somehow received a brief stay, which some believe was to allow McVeigh to be the first federal execution in the modern era. For his last meal, Garza chose to have some French fries, onion rings, steak, 3 slices of bread, and a Diet Coke. Once strapped to the gurney, his final words were, "I just want to say that I'm sorry, and I apologize for all the pain and grief that I have caused. I ask your forgiveness, and God bless." It only took 3 minutes from the time he was injected for him to be declared dead.
One of the world's major cocaine kingpins won out of federal prison because he is in poor health. The 81-year-old says he's suffering from prostate and colon cancer.
That was the last anyone ever heard of Rodriguez Orihuela before his death was announced 2 years later. He died in one place he despised for years, prison. And unfortunately for him, the way he died was even more tragic. For context, Gilberto Rodriguez Orihuela was one of the most infamous drug lords in history, co-founding the Cali Cartel with his brother Miguel in the late 1970s. Now, they built one of the largest drug empires ever, even rivaling Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel. While Escobar would rely on violence and intimidation, Orihuela would take a more business-savvy approach, which included using bribes and political connections to grow their cocaine network worldwide. By the mid-1990s, the Cali cartel was running the show, controlling 80% of the world's cocaine market, and that's solely because Gilberto and his brother were getting creative. In just 3 years, they smuggled at least 137 tons of cocaine hidden in shipments of concrete poles, frozen vegetables, coffee, and even ceramic tiles. Oh yeah, your kitchen remodel might have come with a little extra in those tiles. Okay, that was a boring joke, but you need to understand that these shipments made their way from Colombia to South Florida with stops in Venezuela, Panama, and Guatemala without getting detected. And the result? Over $1.3 billion in profit for the cartel. I mean, these guys weren't just sneaky, they were rolling in riches. Gilberto and Miguel had almost everything money could buy. But their success in drug trafficking didn't last. In 1995, Colombian authorities, under U.S. pressure, arrested Gilberto, signaling the beginning of the end for the Cali cartel. And despite his best efforts to run things from prison, the walls started closing in on him very fast. By December 2004, Gilberto was extradited to the U.S., where he got slapped with a 30-year sentence along with his brother. They were forced to forfeit over $2.1 billion in illegal profit in exchange for the U.S. government not going after their relatives who ran the cartel with them. And while incarcerated, Gilberto's health took a nosedive. Prostate cancers, heart issues, you name it. Then in May 2022, at 83 years old, Rodriguez Orejuela suffered a fatal heart attack in a North Carolina prison medical center after living the high life for years. He passed away quietly, a far cry from the power and wealth he once had.
One of Mexico's most notorious drug lords has been captured by soldiers. Beltran Lever took over leadership of the cartel when his brother Arturo was killed by troops.
For almost every drug lord, getting sent to an American prison feels like hell. But dying in there is the ultimate downfall, a fate Hector tragically met. You really can't mention the origin of drug trafficking in Mexico without saying the name Hector Beltran Leyva. This guy was a key figure in Mexico's infamous drug trade, taking control of the BLO after his brother Arturo was killed in 2009. Hector and his brothers, coming from a family deeply involved in the cartel world, initially worked hand in hand with the Sinaloa cartel, which was led by El Chapo. Together they helped form a drug empire that controlled key trafficking routes, moving massive amounts of cocaine, meth, heroin, and marijuana into the U.S. Unlike some of his counterparts, Hector managed to keep a relatively low profile for a while. He presented himself as a legitimate businessman, dealing in real estate and art. The polished image allowed him to fly under the radar, even as his organization became one of the most violent in Mexico. The BLO was notorious for its ruthlessness, using extreme violence to maintain control and silence its enemies. Things took a dramatic turn in 2008 when the BLO broke away from the Sinaloa cartel. The fallout stemmed from the arrest of Hector's brother Alfredo, which the BLO believed was caused by a betrayal from El Chapo himself. This led to a bloody war between the two factions, sparking widespread violence across the country. Under Hector's command, the BLO teamed up with other rival groups, like the Zetas, further intensifying Mexico's already brutal drug wars. But despite growing up with the pressure from authorities on both sides of the border, Hector managed to stay on the run for years. All the while, he continued leading the BLO's operations, maintaining his cover as a wealthy businessman. But in 2014, his luck ran out. Mexican authorities arrested Hector in San Miguel de Allende, Guanajuato, a significant victory in the government's ongoing fight against the cartels. By that time, however, the BLO had already begun splintering due to the internal conflicts and relentless law enforcement efforts. But after his capture, Hector was extradited to the U.S., facing a slew of charges related to his involvement in drug trafficking and organized crime. Even in prison, his name would still carry weight due to his deep connections within the Mexican cartel network and his specific role in the bloody battles that had shaken the country. Then, in 2018, Hector's story took a sudden, quiet end as he would die of a heart attack in a Mexican prison at the age of 56. It was an unexpected, almost anticlimactic ending for a man who had once wielded so much power and wealth. But his death certainly didn't mark the end of violence or the chaos that he had been a part of. Those repercussions continue rippling through Mexico today.
Detective Watts says Martinez told him he had killed more than 30 people since he was 16 years old. Why? It was, he told Watts, his job.
Could you tell us
how many people you killed?
About 36 people.
That was Jose Manuel Martinez, also known as El Mano Negra, or the Black Hand. And believe me when we tell you that he didn't get that nickname for nothing. Born in Mexico in 1962, Martinez led a double life for years as a seemingly normal family man, while secretly working as a hitman for various drug cartels and organized crime groups. He operated primarily in the U.S., committing murders for hire over several decades. Martinez confessed to killing more than 30 people, mostly in connection with drug disputes or as part of cartel operations. His murderous spree would start from the 1980s into 2013, covering states like California, Florida, and Alabama. He was known for his cold and calculated methods, with the ability to elude capture for so long it left law enforcement baffled. And despite the scale of his crimes, Martinez managed to maintain a low profile, blending into society without raising suspicion. May 17, 2013, he was finally arrested in Arizona after crossing the border from Mexico. He was initially charged with a single murder, but during police interrogations, he stunned investigators by making more confessions. His confession led to further investigations across multiple states, ultimately uncovering his long-standing role as a cartel sicario. But here's the thing. Once he was caught, Martinez didn't even try to deny or sugarcoat his crimes. He was as honest as possible, and for some reason, it just seemed like he didn't feel any remorse for anything, nor did he act like he disliked it. In 2015, he pled guilty to several murders and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He's currently serving time at a prison in California, and let's just say he joins the long list of cartel sicarios whose lives have been condemned behind bars. Another cartel hitman who got sentenced to death would be Hector Acosta. Now, by the time you hear the crimes he committed, you'll understand why. September 2017, Hector shot his then roommate, Eric Zelaya, and Zelaya's girlfriend, Irish Chirinos, to death while in their sleep. He then mutilated their bodies with a machete before dumping it into a shallow grave in his backyard. However, before he covered the grave, he decapitated Zelaya's corpse and left it on the sidewalk close to an AT&T stadium with a note that read, La raza se destreta y faltan cuatro, which translates to, the race or group must be respected and there's only 4 left. Growing up in Monterrey, Mexico, Hector took interest in gang violence from as young as 7. He was exposed to many criminals as a kid and soon became one himself. He joined small gangs in Mexico before moving to the US, where his gang affiliations only heightened. He committed dozens of petty crimes for gangs in Arlington and Houston, Texas, before joining the infamous Cartel del Noreste, or in English, the Northeast Cartel. If you didn't know, Cartel del Noreste is a violent Mexican drug cartel that splintered in 2014 from Los Zetas, one of Mexico's most notorious organizations. Based primarily in the northeastern state of Tamaulipas, the cartel is involved in drug trafficking, extortion, kidnapping, and pretty much everything else you can think of. Hector became a sicario, carrying out brutal acts of violence against rivals in the U.S. Now, before killing his own roommate, Hector and his associates murdered another person, Tristan Algin, an Arlington resident who was robbed and shot to death for providing the wrong PIN to his bank account. In a gruesome death, Hector chopped up his body, cutting him up in half and burying the remains inside Algin's home, which he then covered with cement to conceal the crime. I mean, that's pretty brutal, so why did he exactly kill his own roommate? Well, according to Hector's attorneys, they argued in court that he was going through a difficult time following the death of his parents and the departure of his wife, who took their 2 children with her. They claimed the turmoil pushed Hector to kill the couple in retaliation for a drive-by shooting a few weeks earlier, in which Zelaya was suspected to be involved. Further evidence revealed that while awaiting trial, Hector attempted to recruit other inmates into the Northeast Cartel and other drug trafficking organizations. I mean, at this point, what do we even say? It's pretty clear this guy was either completely unhinged or utterly obsessed with being a cartel member. Maybe even both. But in the end, he was found guilty of both murders and sentenced to death. Now he's on death row at the Polunsky Unit for Death Row Inmates in West Livingston, where he'll remain until his execution in Huntsville. August 30th, 2024, Sinaloa cartel member Miguel Gavada was sentenced to 28 years in prison for shipping heroin, meth, and other illicit drugs into Alaska, U.S. While we can only speculate about the tragic fate he might face during his incarceration, a few details from his story suggest that Gavada could only experience a particularly harsh and unforgiving prison life. October 2014 was the month Gavada first came into the government spotlight. He was indicted in Arizona for weapon, money, and drug charges. However, he didn't think twice after posting a bond of $50,000 to flee to Mexico. Even more daring was the fact that Gavada didn't go into hiding, but continued working for the Sinaloa cartel. He managed to evade capture even longer, until February 2020, when a grand jury in Alaska indicted him on a host of other charges, including running a well-operating drug trafficking organization in the United States. Around 2016, Gavada recruited Alaskan women through fake social media profiles and used them to courier drugs to different locations around Alaska and the U.S. To avoid linking them to the operation, the women involved were paid strictly with cash, and their transportation was covered using prepaid debit cards to make sure every shipment was delivered accurately and on time. Each female mule had their male handler, who followed discreetly, instructing them on how to bypass checkpoints at various cities and screening at airports. And if anything ever went wrong, those couriers were taught how to use coded languages to inform their handlers about the situation. Now, knowing he was wanted in the U.S., Gavada never stepped foot in the country after 2014 and ran his whole operation via mobile phone at his Mexican residence. The Sinaloa cartel was smuggling drugs into Alaska by any means necessary, taking advantage of the state's remote communities with minimal police presence. This led to a dramatic increase in overdoses, prompting the DEA to step in and investigate. As arrests were made, some couriers and handlers revealed that Gavada not only managed his drug trafficking operation, but also used violence to maintain control. One courier recounted witnessing Gavada shoot a woman in her knee because he suspected she and her boyfriend had stolen parts of the drugs she was supposed to ship. Now, it was discovered that Gavada boasted about the shooting to other couriers, even showing them photos of the woman's wounded knee as a warning. With enough intelligence on his operations and location, U.S. law enforcement, in coordination with their Mexican counterparts, eventually apprehended Gavada. In September 2021, he was extradited to the U.S. Authorities seized around 7 kilos of meth, 900 grams of cocaine, and several kilos of heroin. Gavada, who reportedly earned millions from this operation, was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 28 years in prison. This sentence will run concurrently with any additional time he receives for a previous Arizona case. His associates, Serena Joseph, Washahotha Zaragoza, and Javier Armando Alvarez Pinuelas, were also arrested. However, thanks to their cooperation, none of them received more than a 5-year sentence. And at the end of the day, it looks like Gavada's substantial criminal record suggests he's in for a rough time behind bars. Around 8 p.m. on July 21, 2024, 3 inmates at the Centinela State Prison ambushed and fatally stabbed notorious gang leader and drug lord Ezekiel Wicked Romo. Now, 47-year-old Ezekiel wasn't officially tied to any cartel, but he was involved in more criminal activities than we can think of. He led the Blythe Street Gang in Panorama City, Northwest LA, with an iron grip. And although he had been in prison for most of his reign, Romo's criminal record dates back to 1995. At just 18 years old, when he killed a man during an argument at a fast food restaurant. I mean, they don't call him wicked for nothing. He was lucky enough to have been released from prison in 2014 after serving 18 years for manslaughter and attacking another inmate. Upon his release, he returned to Panorama City with the goal of tightening his gang's grip. Authorities even found WhatsApp conversations of Romo telling his associates about his plan to have total control over Panorama City, while calling himself a general and his gang an empire. However, in just a few years after his release, Romo was back in prison, serving a life sentence for the murders of at least 8 people, including enemies, informants, and even members of his own gang. And being such a ruthless killer, it was almost destined for him to have a taste of his own medicine. But before that, though, Romo was associated with the Mexican Mafia and the Sinaloa cartels from behind bars. These crime groups controlled the California prison system to some degree, and it afforded Romo some level of freedom, but it also put a target on his back. So on the day of the incident, Romo's assailants, Christian Moreno, Johnny Garcia, and Christian Hernandez, were so determined to end his life that they continued stabbing him until guards had to pepper spray him not once or twice, but 4 times. Romo sustained multiple stab wounds and was rushed to the prison's medical facility, where they tried to save his life. However, he was pronounced dead at 9:52 p.m.